So my name is Brandon. I work for the University of Minnesota, and I do outreach for underrepresented students for the College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resource Sciences. So I'm able to work with some agriculture teachers around these types of subjects, and also individuals that are adjacent to the profession. So I don't think you can see my face. You'll probably just see my slides being shared on the screen right now, but maybe you'll see my face a little bit later. So let's get started. So just a quick agenda of what we're going to go through. Jonathan kind of touched on it, but we'll just have some context and kind of setting up expectations for around how we want to talk about these topics for this webinar, but also the future webinars that we're going to have too, which will be race, racism, and privilege, gender equity, and challenging classism in February, March, and April. And then we'll give a little bit of an overview on defining what ableism and disability justice is and kind of how it manifests itself in society right now. And then Dr. Harvey will speak on, he's done research related to the intersection of CTE and students with disabilities. And then we'll also have a panel of people who will be joining us too with Terry, and then hopefully an ag teacher from Minnesota, Emily Trout, who teaches at an alternative learning program, will be able to join us as well. And then some question and answer with that panel too. And we'll have a couple of resources that you can take away as well. So the reflective questions that we want to give to you are, what were the first ideas you learned about disability and how did you learn them? And these questions are going to be the same reflective questions that we're going to continue to ask throughout this webinar series. So we want you to keep each of them in mind as we go throughout it and as you hear from our panelists and different people who are presenting to you. Do you maintain the same ideas you did from where you first learned them about disability? Why or why not? How does this apply to those that you work with? So if you're an ag teacher, how does this apply to the students you work with? What can you do to welcome those with marginalized identities better? So just a few expectations. We know that sometimes the ability to speak in these spaces can be somewhat tricky because they can be sensitive. Maybe not this topic, but potentially topics in the future. So we do want to set some community norms of what that might look like. So if you're going to ask a question, we ask just that you'll speak from your personal experiences and make sure that any individuals who are involved in your stories, that you respect the confidentiality of those stories and the individuals that are involved in them. Remember that there are no quick fixes. So while we certainly want to center disabled people or people with disabilities in our conversations, we also know that a lot of the issues are systemic and it's not easy to fix them. If you have a question that you want to share, feel free to use first draft language with it. Obviously, we want to be sensitive to those that are in the spaces with us, but we also welcome you to use language that you maybe haven't had a chance to form before. And then we'll ask you to make space and take space. So definitely ask questions. That would be referring to take space in our question and answer time during the panel. Assume positive intentions and own negative impact. So if you have something that you would like to share and it might come across negatively, own that negative impact that it might have. As well as if you perceive something from somebody else negatively, assume that they have a positive intention in sharing it at the same time. And then recognize that there are multiple truths that exist. So your truth can exist simultaneously with somebody else's truth. And then also recognize that some truths might only have a part of it that are actually true. And then when we talk about each of these topics, we're going to also share that for those with privileged identities, especially, that it's not our fault, but it is our responsibility to be able to do the work around this, to be able to learn about it, and just to do the work around each of these topics. And then if we ask you to share what you're learning or share outside of these spaces, we ask that you share what you are actually learning from them and not just what you have already known in the past. It's something that you're going through, you're processing, you're doing critical thinking about. And then also, for your identities, just because you are doesn't mean you understand, and just because you're not doesn't mean you don't understand. So as a person who identifies as able-bodied. Just because I am able-bodied doesn't mean that I might not understand some of the voices that people with disability bring to the table. But just because I'm also not doesn't mean that I don't understand that either. So come with that perspective and understanding of your identity. So a couple of the definitions that we'll use to frame this discussion. So this definition here of disability is from the ADA, so American Disabilities Act, and then also the amendment that was proposed to it in 2008 to pass. And then you can see there that ableism is prejudice, discrimination, violence, and restricted access based on status of disability. So ableism is oftentimes a word that people are less familiar with, but is still very important. A lot of times when we think of isms, we think of racism or sexism are probably two of the bigger ones that come to mind. But ableism is just as prominent too when we think of able-bodied people. So some examples of that might be that stairs are the norm in a lot of physical spaces and buildings, and that can provide a physical barrier to a lot of people. For those who have dietary restrictions, wheat and corn are in a lot of foods, and that might not be a possibility for certain people. Driving is necessary to go to a lot of different places, especially in rural areas. So we certainly want to center each of those thoughts in the idea of like, this is what ableism looks like. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a personal thing that I am enforcing upon you. It oftentimes means it's a systemic thing and we participate within that system. Next slide. So just a couple of things around referring to people with disabilities. There are two different approaches that you can often take in this type of work in language and discussing with people with disabilities. And a lot of the times, the most important thing is just to simply understand the experiences that those people have and understanding what they're saying about themselves. So if they refer to themselves as a disabled person, which would be an identity first language, then you're obviously going to want to refer to them in that way because that's how they want to be referred to. But some people prefer to be referred to in a person first language manner. And so then you might want to refer to them as a person with a disability. The key in this is that there is really no end all be all, and there really isn't any end all be all in any type of language related to these topics. It's just important to understand that a lot of it is individualized and contextualized to people, and that we want to be sure that we're paying attention to people's experiences. And if we don't say the right things, that we continue to push forward in trying to say the right things and making sure that we're being empathetic to those people's experiences. So you'll notice that person first language is often preferred by people who've been in institutional systems and other people who haven't necessarily been diagnosed or claimed a specific disability identity. And then you'll notice identity first language is frequently preferred in deaf, blind, and autistic community. And again, it's not an end all be all, but it is a more common piece of that. So for approaching people who might need assistance, whether it be physical or cognitive assistance, there's kind of a general guideline that we can follow. I should also mention that a lot of this content is from the University of Minnesota Office for Equity and Diversity. And this particular piece of how to interact with people is a model that is directly from them. So if you observe something happening, usually the best thing you can do is just pause and observe and sit, kind of witness what's happening and take a moment. If it doesn't look like any help is needed, move on. If it does look like there's help needed, ask. Don't just go in and help and intrude on it. Ask the person in a respectful manner if they do need help. And if they say they don't need help, no means no, don't help them. If they do need help, yes means yes, do help them with it. So make sure that you're listening to what they are asking of you to do to help them. And then go ahead and participate in whichever way that they've asked you to participate. And then how did disability become an actual thing? When we think of ability and disability, a lot of times it is actually a construct that is prevalent in our society. And there's kind of been an evolution on models of thinking. So there's the moral model, which says that this is more historical and not quite as prevalent in our society now, but it's the idea that disability is wrong. It's fundamentally wrong, and that humans with disabilities are just wrong. And it's obviously not something that we like to hear, but that's a more historical piece of it. And there's like things that you can think of, like people being jailed for disabilities that they have, or in historical texts, people being shunned from society because of disabilities that they might have had. The next one is charity model, which is kind of this idea of a little bit of like savior complex that, oh, I'm going to help you out of the good of my heart, and not really actually holding those people up to the same standard of your own being. So a lot of times people will think of this as like telethons, and thinking like, oh, we're doing all this good charity for these people, which yes, may be great, but sometimes can also come across in a demeaning way that looks like you're pitying that person and is not holding their social being and identity to the same value as theirs. And then medical and rehab model are pretty similar in a lot of ways, I would say, but it kind of looks at disability as something that people are not necessarily whole beings for at least the medicalization model, or they're abnormal for the rehab model. And so then there's this idea that we can fix it in some way and make it more pure by accommodating to that. But one model that has been really prevalent in the disability community, and particularly in disability justice, is the social model, which really focuses on centering people with disabilities and disabled people as they are, and centering their voices in conversations and putting them at the center of creating spaces so that they're accessible for those people especially. So when we think about that, we put their bodies, we put their minds and abilities to the center of the conversations that we're having. And so that is about it for my little spiel of context that I'll set up for everybody. But we'll just leave you with this quote, that disability only becomes a tragedy when society fails to provide the things we need to lead our lives. And then I will turn it over to Dr. Harvey.
All right. Well, thank you for allowing me to join your webinar, AgEd for All. I've framed my conversation literally around career and technical ed, and just have brought some additional information to the table on this topic. And again, just kind of highlighted this as career and technical education for high school students with disabilities. What does it all mean? And what I want to do is provide you with just some opportunity to look at policy, to look at what current legislation says, to look at some of the numbers, particularly here in Pennsylvania. We've kind of focused on those in this particular presentation, and then talk a little bit more broadly about students with disabilities who are in CTE programs as part of the K-12 educational system. Having said that, let's get started. One of the things that's important to understand is that the United States really throughout history has valued education, even though history says that the founding fathers did not put education as a responsibility in the Constitution as a federal responsibility. There certainly was federal interest in making sure that the states had responsibility for providing education. And what policymakers have known for a good long time from our founding fathers forward is that good education policy is good economic policy. And those of us who are in CTE and AgEd understand that good education policy is good economic policy, because while we're teaching about ag sciences and so forth, or we're teaching about CTE programs and occupationally specific learning, that's education, but it also has a significant employment link for the United States. So one of the things that frames this conversation, conceptual framework, is going to be legislation and the fact that education and economics are closely linked. when we look at college and career readiness, which had its roots in the American Rehab, excuse me, and I'm having a senior moment here, forgive me, but the act that was taking a look at recovery, American Recovery Act, excuse me. College and career readiness was prevalent in that piece of legislation, looking at helping to move people forward in the 21st century for employment, so that students were either college ready upon high school graduation or they were career ready upon high school graduation. The Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015, which replaced No Child Left Behind, supports those initiatives and allows states real latitude in developing CCR plans in relationship to state planning. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act of 2014, which is it takes in pieces of the Rehab Act and really works more broadly with the issues of Department of Labor, clearly has focused on employment opportunities and has carved out a lot of waterfront in support for persons with disabilities as well. These acts, among other laws, really have provided supports for people both from a civil rights perspective, but also from an employment perspective as far as disability public policy. And so there are just a host of different pieces of legislation that support persons with disabilities being successful in American society and successful in relationship to employment opportunities. Career and technical education is no different in that it is a K-12 and post-secondary ed piece of legislation under Perkins that has long provided occupational skills training and educational services, particularly services to all, including special populations, which includes students with disabilities. From the Vocational Education Act that was crafted under the Kennedy administration and signed into law under the Johnson administration in the early 60s under the Great Society, to the current reauthorization of Perkins 5 in 2018, we've seen that there's been a longstanding commitment for occupational skills training as part of the educational services that are offered in this country, and again, under special populations, a commitment to students with disabilities. Under the law that provides for educational programming and has an emphasis on post-school outcomes for students with disabilities in the K-12 system, that piece of legislation started under the Education Handicapped Children Act of 1975, most commonly known as PL 94-142. That was federal legislation that provided for equal opportunity and equal access to public education for students with disabilities. Longstanding through the 2004 IDEA, current legislation, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, we have seen a longstanding commitment for support services in education for students with disabilities. Just some background information for you. I don't want to get into a law class with you under IDEA or with Perkins, but I do think that it's important to just hit a couple of things that are highlighted. The IDEA piece of legislation provides supports and services for individuals identified with a disability, and they are provided with an individualized educational plan that supports their educational needs in the K-12 system. As we move forward through secondary special education programs, they really are emphasizing post-school outcomes for students with disabilities to help them move from school to successful opportunities in adult life. The IDEA mandates that those students who are 16 years old and older, younger under some circumstances, and this depends on states. I was in Indiana for several years as a professor at Ball State University in the special education department. Indiana's identification of IDEA at the state level was every student 14 years or older had an IEP with transition services provided, but the federal law says that every student at age 16. But what happens with secondary students is that they have actually transition planning supports and services written into their individualized educational program. And that's identified as a coordinated set of personalized skills and activities that help or tailor supports and services to that student. The transition plan is a results-oriented process that focuses on both academic and functional achievement. And then the quote here that's important is to help students with disabilities move from school to post-school activities, which include post-secondary ed, vocational education, integrated employment, including supported employment, continuing in adult education, adult services, independent living, and community participation. It's important to understand under IDEA that the IEP that a student brings to the table, particularly a transition IEP at age 16, specifies post-secondary goals that are to be identified based on the student's individual strengths, their interests, and their preferences. I also include in this conversation abilities. And typically when I have taught courses in special education law and policy and transition, I've referred to this as SPINs because it's the student's preferences, interests, needs, and strengths that really govern what we do with students in secondary programs, supports that they have, and the kind of curriculum and the kind of coursework that they're engaged in. When we think about Perkins and the Perkins reauthorization, it's important to understand what happened in Perkins 4 remains solid in many cases in Perkins 5. And so the legislation that was passed in 2006 is heavily embedded in the legislation that was passed in 2018. And it's important to understand that really CTE is designed to prepare students to move forward into careers that will lead them to self-sufficiency. The Perkins Law and the occupational skills training that's associated with that really are helping to provide education that leads to economic prosperity and economic opportunity. The intent here is to make sure that students are prepared, including students with special populations, to move forward into either post-secondary education or employment opportunities where there are going to be high skills, high wage, and in-demand occupations. Additionally, when we take a look at the newly reauthorized Perkins 5, I think things that are important for ag ed teachers to understand is that the new law, which is actually termed Strengthening Careers in Technical Education for the 21st Century Act, that new law, commonly referred to as Perkins 5, closely aligns with WIOA, which basically looks at issues of workforce development, career pathways, industry sectors, in-demand jobs and occupations, looking at that at the local level and recognizing that there are a host of opportunities to earn post-secondary credentials. So Perkins aligns with WIOA in making sure that there is common ground around these workforce development issues. It also aligns with ESSA, which is, remember, the replacement for the No Child Left Behind Act, where it recognizes additional special populations, including those students with disabilities. It also talks extensively about looking at dual credit, concurrent enrollment, pathways, programs like in Pennsylvania, our SOAR program, which support students who are in high school actually having secondary, post-secondary credit, concurrent enrollment and credit earning as an opportunity to move forward to post-secondary kinds of opportunities and endeavors. It also talks about evidence-based and evidence-based best practices, and also speaks specifically to universal design for learning, which will be a piece that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. All of which is to say, if you review Perkins 5, Perkins 5 still remains and retains a very strong commitment to special populations, particularly students with disabilities. And so what we see is that there is an interest in providing opportunities for students with disabilities in career and tech ed. There's also an emphasis in looking at those students who are participating as concentrators in secondary CTE in relationship to occupational opportunity for those young people. When we think about some design features for students with disabilities who are in CTE and in ag ed programs, I think it's important to understand, what does CTE offer for students with disabilities? And then from there, making sure that there is a good fit and a clear understanding of both what CTE offers as far as occupational skills training and opportunities in industry, and what students with disabilities need in relationship to the supports, the services, and the design features of curriculum that will help them so that, that appropriate employment decisions and enrollment decisions are made. And I do say in this slide, enrollment decisions, but enrollment decisions need to be identified with future employment decisions in industry areas. And that's where spins and understanding what are the in-demand occupations and the types of industries that are employing in a local geographic area are going to be important. So it's important for both special educators and for CTE educators to understand Perkins. Perkins is occupationally specific career pathways and very clear programs of study that deal with industry credentials and industry learning across an array of occupations within an industry spectrum. It's also important for both groups, special educators and CTE educators, to understand what IDEA is. And IDEA provides very specific, very prescribed protections and services and supports written in an individualized educational program for students who are identified with a disability. And so what are those supports? How do we modify? How do we accommodate? How do we provide opportunities that are realistic for students enrolled in programs? The IEP and understanding CTE are going to be critical. And so those are things that I think are important to understand. Additionally, in looking at the IEP transition goals, the transition goals should associate with the career and technical education and ag ed program constructs as far as occupational identification and taking a look at CTE occupational skills training. So this is really kind of a roadmap of making sure that we have a fit and a good opportunity to provide appropriate services for students with disabilities placed in CTE programs. I think it's critical to understand the players, because students with disabilities don't miraculously just show up in programs. There's a process that's in play under that individualized educational program that is part of the root of IDEA and the legislative process in supporting students with disabilities. The intent really is looking first step at placement, and that's a team decision-making process. The IEP meeting is an opportunity for team players and stakeholders to sit down and to review a student's progress, to review a student's assessment data, to review the student's spins, which are those interests, preferences, needs, and strengths, and really make some decisions about what are the appropriate academic programs, what are the appropriate supports and services, what are the appropriate kinds of placement decisions that occur. That's the first step. And CTE and ag ed people can and should be invited to those meetings where appropriate, where initial placement and continuing placement in CTE programs occurs. The second step is looking at the services. This is now the student that's been placed and is actually in a CTE program. What happens with services for that particular student? And what happens literally is that there is support from the high school special education department for those students under the IEP. Additionally, career and technical ed, ag ed folks, and professionals within CTE provide services as well. These are occupational skills training, these are classroom management issues, these are guidance career supports. These are maybe special populations supports that come in, or special services supports that come in. And ultimately, guidance counselors are involved as well. If your CTE setting has a guidance support staff, they would be involved in helping provide and making sure that services are available. And also, high school guidance counselors are part of this process as well under service delivery. And the third piece to this, players in the process, that I think are important, they're in many cases less visible but equally important, is that if there are supports that are needed, these are things that the IEP will spell out, but if there are additional supports that are needed, your CTE administrator, your director, your assistant director, your pupil services people, your special POPs people would potentially be involved in bringing this information to the table and finding what those supports are that are appropriate. Your special education administrators, every school district has a director of special education and a office of special education that supports the K-12 system. The special ed director and their professional staff would be involved in reviewing what supports might be available or needed. And this also moves into looking at potentially transition and related services providers, which could be outside agencies or outside supports that might be needed to help facilitate. So as we think about students with disabilities who are in CTE programs and in ag ed programs, there are kind of three pieces to this puzzle, if you will, in looking at the players in the process and how to provide supports for young people who are engaged in learning in CTE and occupational skills training. I have just a quick map that takes a look at ACTE's regions. This is ACTE is the Association for Career and Technical Education. It's a national organization. They have their state regions, but they're states that have ACTE divisions, but they also have regions that are compilations of states that make up the geographic regions in the United States. And just very quickly to point out, this upper region number one is the Northeast states. Region number two is the Southeast states. Region number three typically are the Midwestern states. Region number four typically make out the Southwest states. Region number five are the Plains states and the Western states, and they include Alaska and also Hawaii. So ACTE divides the country into 5 basic regions. The only reason I show you this slide is that I want to talk a little bit about students who are concentrators in CTE. And when you think about students who are enrolled in CTE in an enrollment pattern looking at 2011 through 2016, that time period, regional and national average enrollments, we in the Northeast have the highest percentage of students with disabilities in CTE programs that are identified as concentrators at about 16.5%. Region number three, which is the region that is made up of the states in the Midwest, that group of states typically has the second highest, and they're at about 12%. Region number five, which is that Western region, makes up less than 10% of the population in those states regionally. And then the national average for all 50 states is just under 12%. So this just gives you a bird's eye view of data in relationship to students with disabilities who have been and are currently enrolled in secondary CTE programming. All of which is important when we think about, and I've used Pennsylvania as kind of a talking point here. Pennsylvania has the highest percentage at almost 28%, and it has had about that same percentage rate for the last 5 years of students with disabilities who are concentrators in CTE. What this basically says is that Pennsylvania has approaching 1/3 of all of the students in CTE settings that are enrolled in CTE are students who are served by IDEA with an IEP. So having opportunity with equal access, but also providing appropriate supports and services, both sides of IDEA and Perkins are very important. And in Pennsylvania, we have a high percentage. The state with the lowest percentage over time actually is the state of Idaho. And the state of Idaho only has about 7% based on national data that comes from the National Perkins Network Collaboration website. And so Pennsylvania has about 20% higher rate of students with disabilities in CTE. What matters is that you understand who your students are and how you can best serve them. And I use the Pennsylvania example because we have a lot of students with disabilities in CTE who are very successful. And so understanding who those students are, what their needs are, and how we best provide supports and services for them makes a lot of sense. I also use Pennsylvania's data, basically looking at special education information from IDEA. The federal government requires states every December 1st to do a child count. And this child count data is used to then calculate the percentages of students with disabilities in the K-12 system. This data represents K-12, and so it is a bit beyond the high school agriculture and CTE programs at the secondary level that we really are talking about. But I use the data just to give you an overview of what's happening here in Pennsylvania. Over the last 3 years, Pennsylvania has seen a 1% increase in overall enrollment in K-12 students with disabilities. We've gone from 15.9% to 16.9%. And so that's a 1% increase. The other thing that I think is important to identify is that under IDEA, students are identified in one of 12 disability categories. And Brandon talked a little bit about this, but I want to talk a little bit more specifically about this in the sense that when you have a student with a disability, it's important for you to know who the student is, what their disability characteristics are, and what their disability classification and label is, because this will help provide you with background information on the kinds of most appropriate supports and the kinds of needs that you can identify, and then the kinds of activities, supports, and ways to provide equal opportunity and equal access for those individuals. And so students with autism actually have very different needs than students who may have an emotional disability or students who may have a physical impairment. And so understanding that and knowing that are going to be important. The other thing that I want to talk to you about just very briefly is that the world of autism is seeing a significant increase in the number of students who are identified and who are served under IDEA. And so having students with autism or students who are under the spectrum in your coursework is not going to be uncommon and will become more of a reality as we move forward. Students with autism, as they've moved into aging out and into the adult population, also have been very heavily studied in a variety of supports and research to provide opportunities for them to be successful in the competitive workforce. And so looking at employment needs, looking at support services for young people with autism as they have become much more prevalent and their involvement in the K-12 system and their involvement in CTE has been an area of opportunity, but also an area of challenge for some schools and for some teachers. So understanding, working with your special ed people, making sure that you make those connections are going to be important. Also, high percentage groups that you may see are going to be students with emotional disabilities, students with intellectual disabilities, students who have specific learning disabilities, and students who may have basically a identification as other health impairment. That doesn't mean that you won't have students who come from any one of these 12 disability classification groups. The point is that you will want to understand who these young people are and be able to provide them with the appropriate supports and services, working with your special ed department in your CTE setting, in your ag ed programs. Good information. Again, if you notice, the percentages of young people with disabilities in the K-12 schools here in Pennsylvania, in the Commonwealth, are about 17%. That varies from state to state. The students who have been in career and technical education programs at the secondary level here in Pennsylvania typically runs about 20, 27, 28%. And so this just points up some statistics and some interesting food for thought comments. Another area that I think is important for folks to understand, and this comes from the Department of Labor data, this is 2018 data, but basically what it says is that individuals with disabilities really are employed at about 19%, whereas people without disabilities or persons without disabilities are employed at about 65, 66%. Now, this is taking a look at employment across the age range. And so this is a little different look at data, but we're looking and concerned in the area of CTE for students with disabilities in providing occupational skills training and opportunities to boost these competitive employment numbers. Additionally, what we see is that young people who are identified as having a disability in schools are expecting to enroll in some kind of post-secondary ed at about 76% based on a 2007 study. And that compares to about 94% of their same age non-disabled peers or peers without disabilities. The interesting piece, and for years I did the post-school follow-up study in the state of Indiana and reported on their SIM-14 data to the federal government. The studies that we did indicated that students in schools typically identified about 75% as wanting to have some kind of post-secondary education. But when we did the 12 to 18 month 1 year follow-up, we found that only about 35% of those students were actually engaged and involved in some kind of post-secondary ed training. All of which is to say, again, as we're looking to boost employment, we're also looking to boost issues of opportunity for students with disabilities in post-secondary ed. And then there are just some quick data here that come again from a different study looking at enrollment patterns and what that looks like. About 48% in 4-year schools, 20% in 2-year schools, and about 1%, which I think may be a little low with data sharing for technical schools, but it gives some benchmarking and some points of interest as far as post-school outcomes. What does it all mean? Well, what I think it means in relationship to serving students with disabilities and providing opportunities is that what we really need to do is we need to take a look at occupational skills training. What is it that is in the program of studies occupationally that links to employment or links to post-secondary ed opportunities? Those are critical pieces of information that students with disabilities who are going to be in CTE need to be aware of. That's also linked with Perkins and CTE programs of study where we look at competencies, we look at industry standards, we look at safety kinds of parameters. These are all very important facts that need to be part and parcel of the decision making that occur for students with disabilities in CTE programming. And last but not least, when we think about IDEA, we really need to think about what are those transition IEP goals that lead to future employment, future post-secondary education, and lead to successful adult life initiatives and endeavors. And we want to make sure that what we're doing for a student with a disability in a CTE program is meeting their spins, as we talked about earlier, but also making sure that there is a good fit for the program of study and understanding the occupational skills training that will need to be brought to bear. So we're connecting the dots here for students. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to think about an applied appreciative inquiry model where we're thinking about discovering what we're currently doing, and then from there, dreaming about what we want to do and implementing this kind of a model maybe more effectively for students who are placed in career and technical education, and dreaming about effective programming and how that model can best work and provide the most opportunity the best supports and lead to the best outcomes. From there, you design that particular model and make that happen and put that into place in Destiny so that you implement what you've designed based on what you see as a need and what you've dreamed as best practice and best programming. And then from there, you come back to discovery and taking a look again at what you're doing and go through the cycle again. So I think as we connect the dots, these are a couple of talking points that I would leave you with to think about as far as students with disabilities and their opportunities in ag ed programming. I also think it's important to just take a look at the CTE Program of Study Framework, which has recently come out in October of 18. So this is fairly hot off the press, although the work that's been going on with this has been going on for well over a year. CTE has developed a framework for programs of study that identify 12 standards, and they articulate those in a document where I give you the website here. And if you don't have this document, I would encourage you to think about pulling this document down and reading it, because it does frame out what really would become an ideal program of study framework under CTE programs and support services. What I've done for the purposes of this webinar is talked about implications and applications. And I think when we think about implications for students with disabilities and then applications for students with disabilities in CTE programs, some things we want to think about are student assessment data in order to look at program fit, teacher effectiveness and finding out that teachers are well prepared and have the background and professional development to work with all kinds of students, but particularly students with disabilities served by an IEP, making sure that we have engaged instruction. And so instructional engagement is going to be important in providing those supports as needed, access and being able to take a look at equity for all students, including students with disabilities. I think the implications issue also is to have some career development and some career planning happen in relationship to making the correct decisions, making the correct placements for students with disabilities, and then think about what work-based learning activities might look like and how work-based learning in ag ed and CTE settings make an appropriate placement for those students. Additionally, from an applications perspective, we'll take a look at aligning curriculum and making sure that standards align so that there's a continuity with academic and also functional skills coupled with occupational skills training, taking a look at articulation and sequencing, facilities and equipment and supports there, business and industry partnerships, also understanding that students can really gain and really benefit from those student organizations. FFA is a perfect example of how young people across the spectrum, but young people with disabilities as well, can be very successful in those organizations. That's an applications piece. And then taking a look at program data and taking a look at program improvement opportunities are going to be kind of a applications implications piece that aligns with the ACTE Program of Studies framework and aligns with that application of appreciative inquiry model that I talked about a few minutes ago. I think in Pennsylvania, there are some implications, and I have provided, at least here for the Commonwealth, what makes some sense here. And I know that if you're in other states, you're going to have basically the same kind of information, just not at these websites. You'll need to go to your Department of Education's website and pull down the information that's applicable wherever you are. But one of the things that I think has had significant implications here in Pennsylvania was the Park case in 1971, which predated the Information for Students with Disabilities Education Act. The key here is that we provide students, particularly students with intellectual disabilities, with a lot of opportunity and access in the Commonwealth to education. And that piece of legislation set the foundations for that. Pennsylvania's education code is in Title 22. And so I provided that as an access for people in PA. And Chapter 14 of those Title 22 education codes speaks specifically to the state's regulations and rules for special education services, while Chapter 339 speaks specifically about vocational education rules and regulations. The key here is that Perkins and IDEA legislation are in compliance here in Pennsylvania, or are going to be in compliance in your states as well. They provide protections for students with disabilities in public education. They provide supports for students with disabilities in secondary CTE, and they provide a transition IEP process, which has supports and services identified linked to very specific transition goals that are outcome oriented. Lastly here, I just have some talking points that I think are important. As you work with students with disabilities who are in your ag ed programs, it's important to have opportunities to look at strategies for instruction. There are a whole host of strategies that can be used that include mnemonics and a variety of study skills. There are opportunities for motivational activities. There are a whole host of things that can be helpful to helping students read, to help students write, to help students mathematics, those kinds of things that are going to be important. Your special education teachers will have great opportunities and will be great resources for you in helping you look at strategies for instruction that work for the individual student. Behavior management, classroom management also is going to be important and popular. Obviously, you need to pay attention to what your school policies and school rules are, but I encourage people to articulate classroom rules as well. Make sure that those are well spelled out and that students have a clear understanding of what your expectations are day one. There are a host of opportunities that you can use to support students through classroom management as well. Student engagement is going to be, I think, an element that's important. My thinking is that student engagement is not only the student wanting to learn, but it's really more on the teacher providing educational opportunities that engage students. And those can be done through universal design for learning approaches. Universal design for learning really provides multiple means of providing representation of curriculum and content and concepts. It also provides multiple means for actions and expressions, what students are doing and learning. And it also provides multiple means for engagement, which would mean project-based learning or actual CTE hands-on activities. So universal design for learning and open access really is something that we do in CTE and Ag Ed. And really identifying and honing those skills provides unique opportunities for students with disabilities in your program. Additionally, I think it's important to understand that differentiated instruction works well. And differentiated instruction is providing students with what they need. And teachers can differentiate instruction by really taking a look at their content and how can they differentiate content, taking a look at the process, how can they teach that differently so students learn, how they differentiate the products or the kinds of things that are the outcomes that we expect for students, and how they can differentiate the environment and the affect for student learning. The other thing that the teachers need to be aware of in providing differentiated instruction are student attributes. And those include a student's readiness to learn. Where are they in the learning process? Are they ready to, and do they have the capacity to have advanced skills? And so their readiness to learn the curriculum and the content and helping them to get ready for that. Another piece that's important is to take a look at really the student's learning profile. Are they auditory learners, kinesthetic learners, visual learners? What are their learning modalities? And last but not least is student interest. What motivates the students? What are students interested in? And how can you bring that to bear to help them in providing appropriate educational opportunities and CTE services? I've provided just 2 or 3 websites here for you to take a look at. I think if you go out and do a Google search, you'll be able to have another wider net of resources that are available to you. And I think if you do a Google Scholars search, or if you work with your university libraries, you can do drill down and actually gain research skills and research materials as well. What I think needs to happen and what I'm advocating here is that, students really are in programs. You need to understand how they got there, and then basically understand that public education really is public education. It's education for all. And so knowing the laws, knowing the process is going to be important. Understanding policy and practice, enrollment, recruiting, IEP meetings, and IEP membership. CTE people can and should be serving on those IEP meetings because you know most about your programs, and you should be represented when there are IEP decisions about students with disabilities coming to your programs. And then making sure that there's ample professional development training around those issues and those needs. And then in building capacity, this is really where the rubber hits the road, and it's the crux of my conversation, because much of my research has dealt with the fact that CTE and special ed don't collaborate frequently, and they don't communicate frequently. And so we need to really build a better partnership, teacher to teacher professional relationship, understanding that if you're the CTE teacher, you're the ag ed teacher, and you have a student with a disability in your program, knowing that student's special ed teacher and talking with them and working with them is going to help you be better prepared to serve that student in your program. Communication, information sharing, and collaboration are critical, and those are the pieces that I think are very, very important. And I'm going to leave you with that and move forward with stop sharing, and we can go to the next element. I hope that wasn't too long-winded.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Harvey, for the great information and pulling that all together. Lots of great data shared in that presentation, and that leaves us with a robust 30 minutes allocated for some discussion. So I'd first like to go to our other panel members, Terry and Emily. Was there anything Dr. Harvey touched on in that presentation that you'd like to echo or elaborate on a little bit, or share maybe a case study type example of implementing the models that Dr. Harvey spoke of?
Sure. I was unmuting my microphone. So thank you, Dr. Harvey. That was some really great stuff. I was sort of taking notes as you were speaking as well. There's some other points to sort of touch on. So first of all, my name is Terry Watson. I'm the Assistant Director for Disability Services here at World Campus. So in my role, I interact with the students and also with faculty. In relation to transitional services from K through 12 to higher ed, that's a topic that we actually deal with quite a lot. But the one point I would make, and this goes back to the definition of a disability, is that over time that definition has broadened. And as that definition broadens, the more people covered under the ADA and then under the IDEA has grown. So those numbers that we see that are increasing over time is due to the fact that the definition of a disability has been broadened. So it's including more about, it's including functional limitations and not so much the disability itself. The other part to that too is with Dr. Harvey had the statistics on the types of disabilities that we are seeing. One thing I will point out is there is there's comorbidity with disability. So we may see a student that is presenting, coming to us presenting with multiple of those disabilities, and we have to address those challenges as is. So that was really great stuff, and thank you for sharing that information, Dr. Harvey.
I think one of the things that I would chime in on is that folks really need to understand there is a significant difference between IDEA and what the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act does for students in the K-12 system. That is a very prescriptive, very exacting piece of legislation that actually has litigious pieces that are tied to it if you do not follow an IEP as prescribed. And so you'll want to know your special ed people at the high school level and understand that IDEA is very prescriptive for K-12 students, whereas ADA and 504 504 and the ADA amendments that Brandon talked about, the 2008 amendments, and even the aspects of the Rehab Act that are covered in WIOA are much more broad-based. They're not as prescriptive. They speak specifically to supports, and this is what students who are in post-secondary education are experiencing, and then also in adult life experience. But there really are two definitional perspectives. And so if you're in a high school setting and you're working with students with disabilities who have an IEP, you need to be very aware of that. Now, students with 504 program supports have the same kinds of services, but they are not as heavily prescribed as the IDEA does in the K-12 system. And so as people move into adult life, they're covered under ADA, they're covered under 504, which has a different definitional perspective. But you need to know both. And so this is good information. And Terry, I appreciate your sharing that.
All right. So I'm going to share a little bit too. I'm Emily Trout. I teach at the Saints Academy Saints Online School, about an hour north of Minneapolis. So kind of on the rural side of things as well for a lot of ag programs. But I just wanted to touch on some of the classroom experience that I have. Saints Academy is an alternative education program. So a lot of our students we see have mental disabilities. We don't have as many on the physical side. But we do have 25% of our student population having some sort of an IEP or a 504 specialized learning plan. So we are very heavy in that. So I just want to share some of the stuff that I found to be successful throughout the last couple of years while I've been here. I think what you guys have both touched on as being really important is getting to know the students and what that disability looks like for each individual student. And I mean, as far as teaching goes, that's the most important thing is building relationships. So I just wanted to emphasize that point again, especially for our students that do have disabilities, getting to know them and what's comfortable for one student with the same disability might not always, be something that another student is comfortable with. So for me, I plan alternative assignments for all of my kids so they know that they have the option to produce written work. They can do a project, they can do a speech. For all of our assignments, I have a rubric, and as long as they meet the requirements on the rubric, it doesn't matter to me how they do it. So I have two students that with their mental disability, sensory and touch is a really big issue for them. And so when we're out in the greenhouse planting, I still want them to be involved and to be engaged in what we're doing. And so they do the design of the flyers for the plant sale. They do the scheduling and the planning for all of that, or they'll be the foreman for what's happening out in the greenhouse. So not necessarily physically touching the plants or the potting soil, but still being involved in every step of the process too. Another thing that is really important in my classroom, I think, is movement breaks. Getting kids to sit and focus for a full hour can be really hard, especially when you've got, a population in your school, 20% disabilities. Our school only has 80 kids total, so very small. So every hour I have several students with an IEP in that class. So, working for 10 minutes, 15 minutes of instruction, they know that they get a 2-minute time where they will all get up in the classroom, we'll walk around, we'll do stretches, I'll project movement activities onto our smart board, just as a chance for them to kind of stretch, get out their jitters so they can refocus after the lesson. Another thing that I do for presentations, all students are required to present, but those presentations can look different. So if a student is comfortable presenting in front of the entire class, they are more than welcome to do that. But then I'll also give them the option to do one-on-one presentations with me, either before school, after school, during our homeroom hour, or they can come in and they can present to a group of 2 or 3 students, whatever they're comfortable with as far as that goes. And the biggest thing that I think for our students with disabilities is building their self-esteem. Chances are if they're in alternative ed, they've already experienced other struggles in their life and they're not used to being successful in a traditional academic setting. So starting from the basics and celebrating those small successes when we see them is so important to build their self-esteem, to continue, have them continue to keep wanting to learn and being engaged within the school process.
Okay, thank you, Emily and Terry. As Brandon is pulling up the slide here, with roughly 20 minutes remaining, I think one of the most important parts of this discussion here today is the fact that we've allocated time to have this discussion, which we rarely get the opportunity to. So I know there's a number of, in addition to Emily, there's a number of active teachers on the webinar here this evening. What are the questions that you have? And specifically as a bit of guidance, we have the IEPs for in the school building and during classroom instruction, but as far as being fully inclusive in the agricultural education model, how are we including students with disabilities as far as FFA involvement? How are we including students with disabilities and accommodating their needs in supervised agricultural experience projects? So teachers on the call or university faculty from either institution that kind of keep a tab on these topics within your states. What are some of the challenges? What are some of the case study examples of accommodations made to make sure that programs and all of the three circles of the Ag Ed model are truly inclusive for student participation? And I just realized for our attendees, if you wish to speak, you can simply raise your hand through the button in the panelist box, and I will grant you permission to talk verbally. You can also pose your question to everybody or to myself using the chat box. So is there anybody on the call that would like to get unmuted and pose a question, pose a problem, pose a challenge that you or a program that you know of in your state is facing, or as you're kind of designing your inclusivity model for your program, any advice or idea that you'd like to run past our guest panel here today while we have everybody together focused on the topic? Is everybody comfortable with finding that raise hand button in the panelist or in the participant box? So Emily, what accommodations have you, if any, have you made as far as accommodations for students with disabilities of all types, in as far as FFA involvement?
So for FFA involvement, it can be really tricky to get students to even want to be involved, especially when we're talking about the career development events and all the studying and the knowledge that you have to learn through that. So I start by putting my emphasis on what we're doing within our chapter. So the service projects, the events within the school, to get them engaged that way. Just because you're in FFA doesn't mean that you have to compete in the contest. I think there's so much more to FFA with all of the leadership opportunities available now. So for students who aren't comfortable competing because of a learning disability of some sort, I make sure that I emphasize that there's so many other options to get involved And, you know, if you start local at the chapter and gain their confidence, then it's easier for them to be willing to step out of their comfort zone and try something maybe at the regional level next time. We do have an EA that is available to come with for any FFA events or contests or leadership retreats that we go to. So I think having the students know that an EA will be there if they were to need one is helpful too, because if we go to events, I'm not always able to be, you know, with every student in the same location. So I think having that extra security of an adult that they know and they trust there helps too.
Thanks for sharing that. The question from Harley, read some research discussing a disproportionate number of young men of color who have referred for behavioral disorders. How can teachers check bias and differentiate between students with genuine behavioral disabilities and students who may simply be resisting instruction because of other reasons? Anybody from the panel, welcome to jump in.
That's a great question. There is actually a lot of studies, and if you actually take a look at some of the studies on diagnosing people of color with like a learning disability or behavioral disabilities, there's even studies that show there's bias within that setup. I'll give you an example, and it's really not towards people of color, but more of a situation in which I dealt with when I was a behavioral therapist in Maine. When a child was being asked about where, I think the question was in the evaluation, where do you eat dinner? And the evaluators were looking at the response of at the dinner table. But this particular child did not have a dinner table. So, you know, even in the evaluation process, we're starting to see biases pop up. So to sort of address that question is, I think that, and this was mentioned a couple of times by both Emily and Dr. Harvey, is that it is so important for teachers to be part of that engaging process. If a student has, if a teacher has concerns about a student's behavior, besides making assumptions that is due to a behavioral disability, it is important to sort of engage those around you, either it's a counselor at the school or someone that's in charge of the special education department, before making those kind of judgments and putting a child sometimes through some unnecessary struggles. But that's a really good question.
Dr. Harvey, did you have a comment to that?
Yeah, I just was going to say that I think it's important to understand the student, to get background from the student's IEP, and to work with both the student and also with parents on these kinds of issues, because these are the folks that have the best information. I will say that there has been a lot of work that's been done looking at persons of color, particularly male African Americans, in relationship to being identified as having a behavioral problem, a behavioral disability. The issues there are to just read the literature and see what some of the more common literature is saying. There also are strategies that are presented in that literature as well. But from my perspective, understand the student. Again, it comes back to student engagement and classroom management issues. I think that if you have programming that's on target, that students are interested and motivated with, basically a lot of these kinds of issues will be resolved. And I think that one of the things that's important is that we in CTE and in Ag Ed are really blessed with the fact that we have a lot of moving parts and a lot of things of interest in our programs that help motivate students. Last but not least, get to know the student, because that person-to-person contact, as Emily has said, building that relationship goes an awful long way with effective instruction and minimizing behavior. And I used to do a balance when I was teaching undergrads in special education classrooms with, if you've got good student motivation and good classroom instruction, you're going to have limited issues with student behavior. But if you don't have great instruction, you're going to have a whole lot more potential behavior management problems. So this is a great question. As Brandon said early on, there are no easy answers, but I think that the panel has provided good insight into what to do and how to do. And part of that is to get to know the student and understand the student's background and history.
So for us, if we see that students are being disruptive or certain ones are being resistant and defying, every Tuesday and Thursday morning, we meet as a staff, and there's only 10 of us, so it's easy to do that on those mornings. And we discuss our concerns and see, is it just one teacher that this student may be resisting? Is it something that we're seeing across the board? And we take it by a case-by-case basis, and then the teacher that has the best relationship with that student is the one that will approach the student and will work through the issues and see where the problem is coming from, because maybe it was something that happened in the classroom that the teacher wasn't aware of. Maybe it's students who are in the class. Maybe it is stuff that's going on with their disability in ways that they can't process what's happening and how to appropriately respond. So we do that. And then on Mondays, we have a team. It's called our SIT team. So it's our intervention team that gets together, and they take kids from the Tuesday and Thursday meetings who we've approached, we've tried to connect with, we've tried to see what's going on, and then we take them to the intervention process if what we tried first didn't work, to give a more directed approach to see why the defiance is there. Is it because of the disability, or is it because of an outlying factor?
One thing I also keep in mind too is, and again, I love saying the word research study shows, but is that the stigma of disability, and it just goes back to the topic that we were discussing about ableism. The stigma of disability is something that's also could be debilitating, and when you're trying to get services or trying to get folks to disclose. I know on my end, when I'm working with students, a lot of my conversation is trying to break through that stigma wall of having an open conversation. So if you are approaching, and again, we're talking about people of color, but it could be any child. If you're approaching a child that you think may have a disability, just keep in mind there's a stigma there. And not every culture allows for that stigma to work low stigma. So that could be an underlying concept that will stop someone from seeking help.
All great points. Thank you for sharing. So to chum up the water a bit here, let me pose a hypothetical scenario that I'm undoubtedly sure has occurred and has been worked through, and it would be awesome if there were teachers on the webinar tonight that have worked through this scenario. But speaking from both a physical or behavioral emotional disability, for a student that wishes to participate in a supervised agricultural experience project from an immersion or a placement perspective, and for folks that may not be familiar with the ag ed lingo, so to speak, more or less a co-op modeled job internship. How do we overcome and work through employer hesitation to bring on a student with disabilities into their workplace and inherit that liability to them? I'd love for somebody that has worked through that scenario to share their experience and perspective, if anybody's on the call that has done so. if we are not fortunate enough to have anybody like that, panelists, what advice would you offer?
I would love to hear somebody experience if they do have experience in that one.
One of the things that can be done is vocational rehabilitation has the opportunity through WIOA to reach down into the K-12 system and particularly work with secondary programs. And so there may be an opportunity to work with your co-op coordinator in relationship to placement and linking those employers with students and looking at that. There are real benefits to having persons with disabilities in the employment arena. And so, building those positives. And then I think the other thing that's inherent upon the ag ed teacher and the co-op coordinator is to really accentuate in real terms what the student can do, what they bring to the table, what their learning interests are, and going from there. And then if you can build a bridge with coordination with the WIOA workforce so that there are supports there as well in the form of job coaching or those kinds of things. Those are important to explore. But these are all going to happen group at the local level, and this is teacher to teacher, community to community, and agency to agency. That's where that third tier, when I talked about looking at related services in the people and the placement model, that's where this third tier with administrative support comes in.
Yeah, that was very similar to Dr. Harvey. What I was going to recommend as well is going through the Office for Vocational Rehabilitation Services, because they really have a huge focus on young folks, K-12, not K-12, but there's the age of 16 through the ages of 21 as well. It's probably the most underused resource state by state.
And it looks like we have some good conversation from our panelists who have real firsthand experience, which is great. Good.
Yes, Becky and Nina, I have given you audio capability. If either of you or both of you wish to unmute and elaborate, sounds like you have some great experience related to that matter. We'd love to hear more.
I'll defer to Becky first.
Okay, Becky is going to
She's going to go to a conference room, so I'll go
look for another space to get to. But I think a lot of the things that we've hit on here, career technical education tends to, naturally hit on that interest piece that gets students interested and wanting to participate and oh, okay. I was just reading Nina's message. Interest doesn't seem to be the issue, but again, as far as creating that full inclusivity factor, FFA and SAE specifically, in activities outside of the school, the brick and mortar school building, would seem to be the biggest challenges to me. So I'm really interested in hearing some of these case study examples here of success that hopefully may spark some motivation and creativity in others here. Okay, Becky, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Becky Haddad. I currently am an instructor at Oregon State University and taught in Minnesota for 5 years prior to coming out here. And we had a farm to school program. We had a small garden at our school, but we also partnered with Tangletown Gardens, which was a local vertically integrated farms. So they had their farm and greenhouses near our school, and then had a restaurant, and they have a restaurant and greenhouse space in the Twin Cities. And so we had been partnering with them, and we happened to take a field trip with my 7th graders that we had a couple of our SPED students along for. And their paraprofessional was along with us and got talking with the owner, and they ended up working it out that the students could do some of their work placement on that farm as just kind of a partnership there. And so we had a paraprofessional who went out with those students. Some of those students still work there. Some of those students ended up graduating and are now they've moved into a full-time job. And so it was one of those, just by them being in class and having those conversations, that a really cool relationship ended up kind of fostering and growing through that experience.
Excellent, Becky. Thank you so much for sharing that. As a, just an add-on to this discussion, I feel from the career and technical education side of things that there's a little bit more onus on us to aid students not only in preparing for careers, but using our connections to the industry, to the workplace, to facilitate that transition process. Whereas, special ed teachers and core subject teachers don't necessarily always have the luxury of that connectedness to our different industries. And I think, we're blessed with that, and we owe it to students to utilize that industry network to try to aid them in their transitionary phases from education to the workplace. It's great to hear examples of that happening through the CTE and Ag Ed programs. Go ahead.
I just want to say, I think it's important as well. When I was part of the CTE administrative team in Maine, we did an awful lot of work reaching out, using our occupational advisory committees and using the Chamber of Commerce, and just really networking. It was good for the center. It was good for our programs. It was good for our students, and it was good for students with disabilities. So again, just building those bridges and doing the kinds of things that Becky talked about at the local level are huge to help kids be successful.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I see Brandon is sharing screen here with some resources. Go ahead, Brandon.
Hi, I was just going to share some resources, but these are ones that we'll send out via email too for those that shared in the chat, and post in the Facebook event too. So the Z link, the z.umn.edu/agedforall, it'll redirect to that Facebook event after today. And these resources will be available there.
Yes, I will compile a list of all resources shared by Dr. Harvey and Brandon throughout the webinar today. I will send those along with the link to the recording of this webinar for reference later. Of course, I hope that we can get some social media chatter through the hashtag #AgEdForAll handle. There's Brandon and my contact information for further inquiry to this webinar series, which I'm going to bring up what we have coming up for the rest of this 4-part series here in a second. And at this time, I'll also thank our guest presenters, Dr. Harvey and Terry and Emily. Unfortunately, Wendy Chalmers, a learning support teacher at Sun Tech Center, last minute thing like Dr. Chatters, was unable to join us at the last second, but there's that contact information as well. I can also, after verifying with her, ask if Dr. Chatters would mind share if I shared her contact information as well, just as another resource and piece of the network that we're building here. So at this time, I'll also thank all of our presenters that were able to make it, for giving up their time, sharing their expertise, experience, and knowledge. I'm going to swipe share screen here for just a moment and make everybody aware of the remaining series coming up here. Our next one is on February 13th, focused on race, racism, and privilege. Brandon is the lead coordinator on that session. In March, we'll be identifying gender equity and wrapping up our series in April, addressing classism. So at this time, let me stop sharing my screen here.